My name is Mike Morris, and I've been chairman of Storm Surge since, 2012. And so just a little housekeeping issue tonight. I'm actually going to pass the baton of the chairmanship to Bill Clary. And Bill, if you know Bill, he's a resident in Newburyport, and he's director of the Climate Action Project at the UU Church in Newburyport. He's also director of the Green Expo, which is not having an event this year, but maybe next year again. And he's also a member of the city's Energy Advisory Committee. So I think we're in good hands, and he's going to do a great job. So thanks, Bill, for standing up, and also for dressing up. He's, he's going to put forth a better image than I have.
He's going somewhere else.
Oh, okay. All right, so in regard to tonight's program, so I think, if you're coming here to a program on blue carbon, then you kind of understand what's going on with climate change. And I think that we're probably all on the same page that we need to have some major changes in the way we produce and use energy globally. And the goal, sort of this unwritten goal written or talked about by scientists is we really need to be at net zero by 2050, and that's only 30 years away. So that's a major transformation in terms of what society globally needs to do. Now, the good news is there is a whole host of technology that's out there in the wings capable of doing that for us. But the rub here is that we need to do more than just get to net zero. We need to start taking carbon out of the atmosphere as well. And fortunately, the Earth has many mechanisms in place, and much of it is in plants, in forests, and things like that. And each year, the forests, when they come into bloom and produce leaves, they pull a whole bunch of carbon out of the atmosphere. Unfortunately, we produce more than what they can pull out, so we keep building up more and more, and hence we have climate change. But anyway, to talk about one facet of this, which is eel grass, does a really good job at sequestering carbon. And I want to introduce Phillip Colarusso, our speaker. He received his master's in environmental science from the University of Massachusetts in Boston. He got his master's, his PhD in marine biology from Northeastern University. He resides in Hamilton, and he's been a scuba diver and marine biologist for the EPA for 30 some odd years. So to talk more about his field and his expertise in carbon sequestration with regards to eel grass, I'd like to bring Phil up here.
Actually, I live in Wenham. There's a thing between Hamilton and Wenham. I want to thank Storm Surge for inviting me, and Fish and Wildlife Service for hosting us in this facility. I'm going to start with a disclaimer, so you know it's going to be a good talk. Everything that I say is my personal opinion, doesn't necessarily reflect EPA official policy. All right, now I can say anything I want. So blue carbon, lungs of the sea, what's the title about? Blue carbon refers to the aquatic environment, and in particular, some aquatic plants that sequester carbon. So we'll talk a little bit about mangroves, salt marshes, and I'll spend a lot of time talking about my particular area of expertise, which is seagrasses. And lungs of the sea, you're going to get a little bit of my travel, my vacation slides in here. I'm one of those people, when I go on vacation, I like to check out the local seagrass or the local mangroves. And we were in the French Riviera a few years ago with my wife and daughter. And the French referred to their seagrass meadows as the lungs of the sea. And I thought that was a very elegant thought, much more elegant than anything we do here. And so I stole that. All right, a little bit of background. I don't think I really need, I'm going to go quickly through climate change. I think this crowd probably doesn't need to be convinced of it, but obviously the CO2 levels in the atmosphere are raising at an accelerated rate. And with that increase in CO2 in the atmosphere, there's a corresponding increase in air temperature as well. Unfortunately, or fortunately or unfortunately, it's not happening equally across the planet, and it's definitely not happening equally seasonally or geographically across the U.S., which may, in part, explain why parts of the country seem to be more skeptical of what's happening, because they're not experiencing it the same way that other parts are. So you can see in our part of the country, in New England, on an annual basis, we're experiencing a much warmer year than we have in the past. In particular, much warmer winters. This winter is, I think, a classic example. Less warming in the summertime, but predominantly it's a phenomenon that's occurring most intensely on the coasts. With increased air temperature, you get increased water temperature. The oceans and the atmosphere are in equilibrium. And again, the changes in water temperatures are not happening equally. And we happen to be in one of the areas in the Atlantic where we're getting the greatest increase in water temperature. So the northwestern Atlantic is essentially a hot spot. The other thing that happens with increased CO2 in the atmosphere and then in the seawater is CO2 and seawater react to form carbonic acid, which ends up reducing the pH of our oceans. And remember, pH is a log scale, so these small changes, it looks like a relatively small change in pH. The blue line is pH, the green is seawater CO2. That small change is actually fairly dramatic. So what are some of the implications of elevated atmospheric CO2 and temperatures for the ocean? Well, increasing water temperatures, sea level rise. And the sea level rise is due to two factors in particular. Actually, the larger of the two is the thermal expansion of water. So water at warmer temperature takes up a larger volume. And if you think about the entire volume of all our oceans, an increase of a couple of degrees, that creates a dramatic increase in sea level rise. And the melting of the ice caps obviously contributes to that. And there's an article today in the Boston Globe about some of the glaciers in Antarctica calving large chunks of ice into the sea. And they're now estimating a 4-foot rise just from the melting of the southern ice cap alone. Ocean acidification is another symptom of climate change. Larger storms, and in particular, heavier precipitation. And I'll talk about that more in a second. And also a change in some normal circulation patterns. There's actually concern that the Gulf Stream, with the increased freshwater melting from the northern ice caps, may deflect the Gulf Stream, maybe completely south or at least further out to sea. Would not have dramatic impacts necessarily for us, but for the UK, they may actually, believe it or not, get much colder because the Gulf Stream kind of keeps them warm. Recently I was in Florida, and that whole stretch from Miami up to West Palm is, as you can see, on the eastern coast of Florida is well built, and there's a fair amount of infrastructure along that entire shoreline. And they're already dealing with sea level rise. So Miami has already spent $400 million on pumps and elevating roadways to avert what they call, quote unquote, sunny day flooding. So that's from the monthly really high tides. They actually have roads flood out. This past December, Fort Lauderdale had 6 sewer pipes break, dumping about 129 million gallons of raw sewage onto the streets and into the coastal waters. And that was a result of saltwater intrusion into their sewer system from sea level rise. And they estimate that it's going to cost about $1.4 billion with a B to repair all the city plumbing that may be at risk from this particular phenomenon. And I think in the newspaper article I was reading down there, they had estimated there was roughly 12,000 sewer pipe breaks in southern Florida since 2012. The majority of them the result of saltwater intrusion or saltwater corrosion of their pipes. closer to home, this is a graphic of what the city of Boston would look like. Originally, it was in 2100 after a 2-meter sea level rise. And the white areas are the areas that would still be upland. The blue areas are areas that would be inundated with seawater. I grew up in Winthrop, which my former house would be underwater. Most of the Back Bay and areas along the Charles would be underwater. A lot of that was built on fill, and so those areas tend to be the first areas that subside, and we have flooding. I think at some point Logan Airport would be probably only good for seaplanes, but this was again with a 2-meter sea level rise, which at the time early models suggested that would happen by 2100. Latest projections make that probably a lot sooner. Closer to home on the North Shore, this is a sign, if anyone's been by the Salem commuter rail station. This is Salem's management of, I guess, sea level rise, warning people not to park there because on high tides it floods out. Anyone who's tried to go to Cranes Beach on a high tide recently, the road to Cranes Beach becomes impassable at really high tides, and the trustees of the reservation in the town of Ipswich have a $250,000 grant to figure out remedies for that particular problem. It's going to be at least $1 million, if not multi-million-dollar construction project. The city of Gloucester, their wastewater sewage plant is actually at or below sea level. And at extremely high tides, it does not operate efficiently. It has salt water backing up into the system, and occasionally they do have issues with raw sewage escaping from the plant. And I'm sure there are many other examples on the North Shore. These are just a handful. So we talked about bigger storms, and hurricanes are what many people think of immediately. And if you look at the 8 strongest hurricanes, and that's by barometric pressure, 4 of them have occurred within the last, since 2017. It's interesting, I did not know this, but prior to naming storms back in 1924 and 32, they just named storms by the islands or areas that got damaged the most. That's why there's 2 quote-unquote Cuba storms. And then the National Weather Service started naming them with different names. And the costliest hurricanes, and again, some of this is a function of, obviously, over time, we've built a lot of infrastructure and buildings along the coastline, and so it's probably not surprising that the costliest hurricanes are also the most recent. But if you summed more or less that total, and I'll exclude Hurricane Andrew, because maybe in 1992 we didn't know as much as we do now. The cost and damage is over $600 billion. Now, I don't know how much we've actually spent as the federal government on promoting clean energy. I suspect it's a lot less than that. Imagine if we had spent 1% of what we're spending on paying for the damages on actually green energy. We would be a lot further along than we are. And it's not just hurricanes. Here it's really nor'easters. Growing up in Winthrop, this was a common sight as a child. And people who live up here know, we get these nor'easter storms, and people have lost homes and property in Plum Island, Sandwich, Situate, Winthrop, Point of Pines, and Revere. And there was what I would call a moderate nor'easter in Boston recently, a year ago. It flooded 5 blocks of downtown Boston. So the Aquarium T station closed. It was underwater, and the Seaport District was completely shut down. It was impassable, Atlantic Avenue, all the way down into the Seaport District. And it was not a big storm. It just happened at a time when it was a very high tide. And so if we ever got the combination of an extremely large storm at an extremely high tide, the damage would be significant. And it's not just damage to human-made structures, but it's also damage to the environment that we care about. And this is seagrass on the beach after a storm. It's uprooted. And it's not just coastal storms. The people here remember the Mother's Day storm of 2006. So that Essex County and southern New Hampshire in particular, and I'm not sure if I actually believe the scale of this number. I remember 22 inches in 8 days as for Essex County. Although I think the pink circle there in just west of Cape Ann, that's my basement. But it was an extensive freshwater event. And all of southern New Hampshire, that watershed drains into Great Bay. So this is Great Bay, southern New Hampshire, Piscataqua River. Great Bay is an inland sea, fairly shallow, and it's excellent habitat for seagrass. It is one of the largest contiguous stands of seagrass in New England. And as such, we've been tracking the acreage of seagrass in that system for a while. And it's been declining over years for a number of reasons, but I want you to particularly focus on the two dots at 2005 and 2006. So we have almost 1,000-acre loss, most of it predominantly due to that storm. So Great Bay normally is a saltwater body. Due to the Mother's Day storm, it went completely fresh for a week. And that stress, or that salinity change, was enough to cause the demise of close to 1,000 acres of seagrass. All right, so what is blue carbon? And this is a picture from France. This is seagrass in the Mediterranean Sea. So blue carbon is a carbon that's associated with salt marsh, seagrasses, and mangroves. And it's not just the carbon that's in the plants themselves. It's the carbon that's in the sediments below the plant. In fact, 99% of the carbon associated with these habitats are not in the plants themselves. They're actually in the sediments, which is an important point, and I'll explain why in a moment. Now, these species in particular have really high growth rates, and thus they absorb large quantities of carbon, especially CO2. And that carbon is evicted to the soils via tissue, and I'll explain how that happens in a second, or by plant-enhanced deposition, and I'll explain that in a second as well. All right, this is a black mangrove from a vacation to the Cayman Islands. If you look at the bottom, and you can see the really tangled root system, and you can see in front of that roots is what the normal beach looks like. It's white sand, but in and among the roots, there's a lot of organic material. So those roots trap organic material and hold it in place and sequester it. And that's the value of all three of these habitats. I'm sure you people are familiar with this. This is actually taken out here in this salt marsh. And salt marshes build up literally feet of peat over time. And that peat is organically rich and it has lots of carbon in it. And the carbon is in an anaerobic environment, so it is sequestered. It's not going anywhere. And this is how I spend a lot of my time looking at, this is our local seagrass species. This is eel grass. It kind of looks like a field of wheat underwater. Very peaceful, swaying in the waves. And they do the same thing that salt marshes and mangroves do. You can see in the foreground, the seafloor is sandy, kind of cobbly, but under the plants themselves, there is that little layer of rich organic matter. And so that, again, is indicative of organic material being trapped and sequestered in place. All right, these are mangroves from Aruba. And so how much do they actually sequester? And the units aren't really particularly important here. I guess what I want you to get from the slide is a relative comparison between habitats. So these are megagrams of CO2 equivalents per hectare per year. And the take-home message is that basically seagrasses, there's two take-home messages from this slide. Seagrasses have the potential to sequester more carbon than any of the other habitats. All of them sequester more carbon than tropical rainforests, which people view as these really big carbon sinks. Tropical rainforests absorb a lot of carbon, but they recycle a lot of carbon, so they don't actually sequester and isolate very much comparatively. The other thing you should take from this slide is there's a huge range in any of these numbers. So there's not a lot of data yet supporting a lot of these estimates, which is why I'm going to talk about some of the data that we've collected to kind of add to the seagrass story. So again, these habitats are much better at sequestering carbon than tropical rainforests. The other thing you should know is they take up a very small percentage of the ocean area, yet they sequester a disproportionately large amount of the carbon sequestered in the ocean. And again, there's lots of uncertainty in those numbers. This is from an editorial that Derek Jackson wrote in the Globe a couple of years ago. He came out in the field with us. We showed him what we were doing. My favorite part of the day was I explained to him how seagrass is really important. It's a valuable habitat for fish. He was asking me, do any things actually eat it directly? And I'm like, yes, brant geese feed on it, particularly in the winter. And as I was saying that, two brant flew right over our heads, landed in the water next to us, and started eating the eel grass. And he just looked at me like, did you do that? I'm like, no, I'm not that good. All right, so just a little, I'm going to take you back to your high school biology for just a second here. So in the upper right, carbon dioxide is in equilibrium between the atmosphere and the ocean. So the more CO2 in the atmosphere, the more that ends up in the ocean. And these plants, they use energy from the light, they absorb that CO2, and they also use nutrients, primarily nitrogen, from the sediments to convert those elements through the miracle of photosynthesis into simple sugars and starch, which are carbohydrates. Those carbohydrates are advected within the plant into the root system. And the reason it does that is the roots are kind of like a savings account. So if you're a plant and you're growing above ground, all kinds of bad things can happen to you. You can be eaten, a wave can come by and you can be ripped off the seafloor. But the roots tend to be more secure. And so if you're a plant and you're going to invest your resources, you want to invest them in a place they are most safe, which is in the root system. The one thing I don't like about this particular graphic is the rhizome actually can extend for 30, 40, 50 meters in either direction, and you can literally get hundreds of upright shoots or individual plants on one rhizome, and it doesn't really depict that here. The good thing about that is individual plants can share resources. And so if the plant over 3 meters to your right is in the shade for some reason, there's a boat over it that particular day, it can extract resources from its neighbor. So that's the other advantage of using a very extensive root and rhizome system as a savings account. Multiple people can contribute to it. Multiple people can borrow from it. So we wanted to add to the data on carbon sequestration, particularly seagrass. The reason for that is we found that there was no data from north of Chesapeake Bay. So there's a fair amount of data in Florida. There's a few studies in Chesapeake Bay, but there's nothing up here. And we saw that as a significant data gap. And so in 2016, we went out to these 8 locations, going from north to south. That is Great Bay, New Hampshire, Gloucester Harbor, Nahant, Cohasset. Then out on the Cape is Pleasant Bay, West Falmouth and Buzzards Bay, Oak Bluffs and the Vineyard, and Nindigret Pond in Rhode Island. And then 2017, we added 3 other sites, which don't appear on here: Portland, Maine, Portland Harbor, Boston Harbor, and Prudence Island, which is in the middle of Narragansett Bay. And so we did a fairly ambitious study. We deployed sediment traps. We took sediment cores in Eel Grass and in reference areas. So we targeted the middle of Eel Grass meadows, but then we also targeted within the same embayment areas that were bare seafloor. They didn't have any vegetation, and that's our reference site. We measured the eelgrass growth, chute density, and the plant morphology, so how tall were the plants, how many leaves did they have, how thick were the leaves, how much did they weigh. And then we used stable isotope analysis of that plant tissue, material we collected in the sediment cores, and the material in the sediment traps. The stable isotopes allow you to determine the origin of that material, because every primary producer has a different stable isotope signature. We also were very fortunate. I had a researcher from the University of Barcelona in Spain reach out to me through the wonders of the internet and asked me if we had any sediment cores which she could do lead-210 analysis on. And lead-210 analysis, one, is really expensive. It takes about a week to process a sample. So I was very happy when she offered to process our samples. And 2, we use it to determine the age of the carbon. And I'll show you some of those results. And then we also measured water temperature and light with some continuous sensors that we deployed at each site. These are the sediment traps. They're basically just 5-inch segments of PVC. Those are with the caps on. We placed them in series of 3. And they're secured to the bottom. This is what they look like when the caps are off. There's actually, it's hard to see, but there's a honeycomb insert within each of these tubes. And the honeycomb insert is there to facilitate deposition of particles as they float by. So there's not kind of a boundary layer effect from the structure itself. So we leave these out for 2 weeks, and we just see what they catch. What is floating through the water column and falling to the bottom in these systems. We don't leave them out for longer than 2 weeks because we found out if you do that, a lot of things start living in them. And that becomes a problem. And for sediment cores, this is not for the faint of heart. I mean, we're there kind of twisting and turning and muscling these plastic tubes into the bottom. And the one on the left is from a reference area. You can see the nature of the sediment. It tends to be rockier, coarser. And the one on the right is from the middle of a seagrass bed. And you can see just by the color, it's very organically rich. I think one of our divers is very proud of himself holding up the tube. And so you can also see that it's difficult to get exactly the same depth at every location. And so we ended up, playing to the lowest common denominator. We could get 30-centimeter cores basically everywhere we went. We got much deeper than that at some locations, but so that everything was equal, we kind of cut off our cores at 30 centimeters. And just for your reference, that is just a fraction of the amount of organic material in these meadows. Similar to the salt marshes, the peat under these meadows goes for meters. So sampling the top 30 centimeters, again, is just a fraction of what is actually there. But that's the data we have, and that's what I'm going to talk about. All right, so this is, we're going to get deep into the data here. So this is percent nitrogen in the eelgrass tissue from plants at each of the locations. And one of the greatest threats to seagrasses is something we call eutrophication, or over-enrichment of coastal waters, primarily by nitrogen. Excess fertilizer, poor sewage treatment, stormwater runoff, all of those things add nitrogen. The plants do need nitrogen to grow, but just like anything else, too much of a good thing is a bad thing. And so what I want you to take from this particular graph is, if you look at the urban areas, so Prudence is Narragansett Bay, Great Bay, you know where it is, in Portland Harbor, where we sampled there is, I think, about maybe a half mile from the City of Portland sewage discharge. Not one of our more glamorous dive locations. Those areas were enriched. Those plants reflected the nitrogen they were being exposed to, so they are enriched in nitrogen. This is a measure of chute density, which is generally a measure of eelgrass health. The thicker, so like Cohasset, which is, you know, our shoreline is on the open coast, almost 1,000 chutes per meter squared. It's a very thick, lush, healthy meadow. Portland, Great Bay, Prudence are all much lower than the other sites, Boston Harbor as well. And I didn't have the data for Boston, nitrogen in the eelgrass in Boston, but I guarantee you it's probably comparable to those other sites. So there's an inverse relationship between the amount of nitrogen in these plants and the health of these meadows. Again, too much nitrogen is a bad thing. All right, getting back to our carbon story. So this is in the sediment traps, and this is just looking at how much carbon is in those particular traps. And the take-home message from this particular slide is, for the most part, the green bars are traps within the eelgrass meadow. The blue bars are the ones in the reference. And again, majority of the sites, you get a lot more carbon in the meadows than you do outside the meadows. That's the take-home message here. Now this is the Sediment Course. And the way to read these slides are from top to bottom. So this is from 0 to 30 centimeters. We subsampled each of the cores. I think the first subsample is 0 to 2 centimeters, 2 to 5, 5 to 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 30. That's what each of those data points represent. The open circles are the reference cores. Again, for the most part, the majority of the sites show that there's more carbon in the cores from the eelgrass meadows than from the reference areas. I don't know what's going on in Prudence Island that is the reverse of that, but everywhere else, that's pretty much the story. So that there's a concentration of carbon in these habitats, both from the sediment traps themselves and within the cores. So where did this carbon come from? So the green dots, dark green represents samples from 2016, the light green is 2017. Those represent the stable isotope data from the eelgrass plants themselves. And they all kind of cluster you know, in one general location, a little bit of spread north to south, but they're all fairly consistent. Well, the red and the orange represent the stable isotope signals from the sediment cores, and the blue represent the stable isotopes from the sediment traps. And that gray rectangular box is literature values for phytoplankton, particulate organic matter in the ocean. They have their own signals. And so you can, if you look at this, you would think, or intuitively you would think, if you put a trap and take a sediment core within the middle of an eelgrass meadow, it would look like the eel grass. But obviously it doesn't. It looks very much like phytoplankton or particulate organic matter, not like the vegetation that's growing right there. And we calculated about 75% of the carbon that ends up in these meadows does not come from the meadow itself. So envision these meadows as basically large filters. The shoots are sticking upright, the tide is going in and out, and the physics of it is that the presence of those plants slow the passing of water and cause the particles in solution to drop out. And the roots and rhizomes of the plants hold those particles in place. So they sequester them so they're out of the carbon cycle. And as long as those meadows stay intact, that carbon is isolated, it doesn't go anywhere. And so it's, again, these meadows may be small, but they're filtering a much larger area than just their footprint. And we, using the lead 210 data, again, these are just in the 30 centimeter cores, and depending on the accumulation rate. So Great Bay, you have a large watershed bringing a lot of organic material down and accumulating at a pretty fast rate. So the 30 centimeter core was only about 20 years old. But in Gloucester, the core was over 100 years old, the carbon in that core. Same as Cohasset, Pleasant Bay was 80 years old, Nitigurt was about 40. And so, again, the carbon in these systems can be very old. And as long as the meadows stay intact, they'll stay there. If we lose the meadow, that carbon gets liberated and goes back into the carbon cycle and contributes to the problem. So how much carbon are we talking about? So this is a meadow that we sample quite frequently in Nahant. It's about 2.5 acres or so. The green is area that we have, through side scan sonar, mapped as being fairly dense, high chute density. And the blue is what we consider lower chute density or patchy, and that's common for these meadows. You have a patchy sequence in the nearshore environment because it's close to where the waves are breaking, and so that habitat may get chewed up a little bit. And on the deep edge of the meadow, light becomes limiting. And so these meadows thin themselves in natural response. So there's less self-shading from plants. And so that's why it naturally gets patchy and it kind of peters out as you increase with water depth. But we calculated, based on the area of these different zones and some of our sampling, that there's about 123 kilograms of carbon in the meadow, which, okay, well, what does that mean? Well, one of my colleagues who has kind of a twisted sense of humor figured out that was the carbon equivalent to 357 human bodies. Now, the reason she was making that comparison was this area in Nahant happens to be the home of the former head of the New England Mafia. Won't name any names because I'm Italian, I don't want to get in trouble. Or it's the equivalent of burning roughly 57,000 gallons of gasoline. Again, that's very rough. So we thought, okay, well, that's interesting. But can we, we're scientists, can we push our data even further, probably beyond the reasonable extrapolation? And so how much carbon are in these meadows in all of Massachusetts? And so DEP did a mapping effort in the mid-90s, and they came up with an acreage about 14,000 hectares of eel grass in Massachusetts. We used some of our data from our cores. Again, just acknowledging that the cores are only 30 centimeters, so we're just scratching the surface. So those 14,000 plus hectares store about 276 million kilograms of carbon, which, if you know the molecular formula of gasoline, that equates to about 128 million gallons of gas. If you drive a Prius like I do, that gives you about 6 trillion Prius miles. You can drive to Pluto and a third of the way back. And At the time we were doing this, there was something that was called the social cost of carbon, which social cost of carbon effectively is how much is the cost to society for putting a ton of carbon in the atmosphere. And the cost to society reflects premature death, people getting asthma, all kinds of health issues, and some economist somewhere figured out that that equates to $40 a ton. And so in Massachusetts, these meadows hold about $12 million worth of carbon. All right, so just the meadows in New England accumulate large quantities of carbon, and most of that carbon is actually coming from outside of the meadow, not from the meadow itself. And the carbon has been there for decades and likely centuries, and it will stay there as long as the meadows stay intact. All right, well, what happens if it doesn't? So if we lose these habitats, what happens to all the carbon that is sequestered there? And we're losing mangroves globally, roughly just under 1% a year. Greatest losses are in Asia for timber, and if you've ever eaten shrimp from Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, those shrimp are generated in shrimp ponds that are dug out of mangrove forests. And so be careful where you get your shrimp. Salt marsh we're also losing, but the data is in many areas is scarce. It's estimated to be 1 to 2% a year, and seagrasses globally 1 to 3% a year. So let's put those losses in context. So the emissions resulting from that conversion and degradation of coastal wetlands is estimated to be 300 to 900 million tons of CO2 equivalents per year. Well, how much is that? Well, that's roughly equivalent to the annual emissions from the energy and industry sectors for Poland and Germany combined. And none of those numbers, so we're probably all familiar with NOAA's climate change modeling. These numbers are not reflected in that modeling. That modeling only talks about emissions from industry, transportation, other sectors. Does not consider emissions from habitat degradation. This is your shrimp ponds in Southeast Asia, and so they dig out areas and they'll use them for a couple of years until they foul, and then they'll move to the next one. They dig another one, and they will just keep going. They don't replant, and so a lot of those foul ponds just stay in place and kind of become anoxic over time. And I suppose that they could be revegetated over time if there was an effort, but most of them just lie fallow at the moment. This is Rumney Marsh in Saugus, Lynn Revere, and it's really an example of probably 101 things not to do to a salt marsh. So the commuter rail line goes through. I ride that every day. GE Lynn to the north was been built on the salt marsh. The Resco Trasta Energy Plant and landfill is just on the other side of the tracks. That's Point of Pines and Revere, Barrier Beach, but the inshore side of that was at one time marsh. The marsh itself, it's hard to see from this picture, but it's pretty well diked and divvied up as well. And so it just, everything you could do wrong to a marsh. And this is what I call stupid people doing things with boats. If you look closely in the bottom right-hand side, you can see, so the dark area is all seagrass, and you can see these people doing donuts and prop dredging the vegetation. And if you look in the bottom right, you can see some tracks from former boats that have strayed out of the channel that are just, I'm not sure what they're doing, but it's not good. All right, so what can we do? So this is a picture from the Bahamas. And the dark area is seagrass, and the light circle areas are around their moorings. And I'll talk about conservation moorings in a minute. So probably the easiest thing that we can all do is eat lower on the food chain. I'm sure people realize that red meat is one of the largest CO2 contributors on the planet. It takes up a lot of land mass, requires a lot of primary production, and just changing the way you eat could make a huge difference. Energy conservation at home. My wife and I have battles with the thermostat, and I think when I'm feeling generous, I turn it up to 62. Become an educated consumer and voter, and make your voice heard. And so I can't really talk about politics, but I will tell you that Governor Baker has the transportation, there's a transportation conservation CTI bill or something.
Transportation Climate Initiative.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Michael. Transportation Climate Initiative, which may raise your gas prices by 17 cents. But all that money gets recycled into repairing infrastructure and for clean energy. Now, I live in Wenham, and I got a mailing from, and again, I won't name the state representative, but I got a mailing from my state representative saying he was against the initiative. And so I emailed him and asked him why he was against the initiative, and if he was against the initiative, knowing all the issues we have on the North Shore with climate and sea level rise, what was his solution for climate change? And his response was he was concerned that this is a regional effort, and New Hampshire apparently has, at the moment, opted out. And so he was concerned that some of the businesses in his district would be disadvantaged compared to across the border in New Hampshire. I'm just not that concerned about 5 or 6 gas stations maybe losing a little bit of business compared to New Hampshire. But I think it's important that we all make our voices heard to our elected officials, no matter what your position on that may be, one way or the other. If you're a boat owner, be a responsible one. Stay in the channel. And conservation moorings. Conservation moorings are moorings that, so the traditional mooring is a float, a chain that goes to the bottom and a block on the bottom. And with the wind and with the tide, that chain will move in a circle, and it gives you this donut-shaped, scoured part at the bottom. That can be eliminated with a conservation mooring. Conservation mooring costs a little bit more. They're about $3,000 or so per mooring. But they will keep the chain off the bottom, they'll keep your boat secure, and they seem to be a reasonable compromise for a slightly better environment. So a lot of this work, especially the data that we collected, required a fair amount of other people. I spent literally 20 days in a row underwater in 2016 collecting that data with the help of all these people who either dove with me, drove the boat, processed the samples, had some role in making that happen. I have to say, I felt pretty damn lucky getting paid for being underwater 20 days in a row. There's we have a saying on our dive team, it never rains underwater. So it's much better being underwater than in the boat, because when it's raining out, you're going to get wet anyway when you're underwater. So it's a much better place to be. So at this point, I will take any questions.
With the graphic in the rhizome, I was just wondering if genetic diversity is a concern at all.
Yeah, so that's actually a very timely question. So these plants are highly clonal. They spread through asexual reproduction, so they send out lateral shoots off of the rhizomes, but they also do produce seeds. And they flower and they produce seeds underwater, and as you might imagine, there's no butterflies or bees underwater. So how they actually get pollinated is still a little bit of a mystery to science. But there is probably a lot less genetic diversity within a meadow because of this, because it's a highly clonal plant. And so when we do restoration projects, and restoration projects generally are done by literally uprooting individual shoots in one location and moving them to another. And it's very labor intensive. But now the general thought is you should take plants from multiple different meadows as donor stock, to increase genetic diversity of your restoration site. And it may have advantages for survival and success in your restoration effort.
So there was a lot of eel grass restoration done as part of the Sandy Grant project with the Great Marsh. And I was curious to know if they identified other sites, let's say within Massachusetts or New England, where they want to do more of this eel grass restoration.
Yeah, so we have people who do this type of work. We have a rule of thumb. If eelgrass is not growing in a location right now, there's probably a reason for it. And if you can't identify the stressor or what's keeping the vegetation from being there and change that factor, then it's probably not worth the effort. So we try to target areas like Boston Harbor after they moved the outfall, out of the harbor, and because water clarity in particular was an issue, and there's been some success in Boston. Chesapeake Bay, the same. Tampa Bay, Florida is another area where they've had large success in restoring this habitat. But in Massachusetts, there's been a bunch of attempts, not a lot of success. We've had a little bit of success out in the vineyard in some of the coastal ponds, actually using seeding, where we collect the reproductive shoots of the plants and put them in mesh bags, tie them to a buoy, and just go away. And then the seeds actually fall out, and the following spring, if they survive, they sprout. We've had some success with that. Alyssa Novak is the one who's done the work up here, and actually did some incredible effort of removing green crabs, which are a big problem for transplanted eelgrass. They seem to, we think out of spite, just kind of cut all the transplants. Yeah, if you don't know why, then it's not worth trying. So we're actually probably at a point in many parts of New England where there is available funding to do this type of work. There's not a lot of good sites where we want to try it, because it's very labor intensive. And in 2018, we were down in Rhode Island, our dive team, and we were working with U.S. Navy, and they came to us. They had to do environmental good work because they had run afoul of our Superfund program. And so we decided we'll do an eelgrass transplanting effort in conjunction with them, and we figured that the Navy, they'll have boats. They came to us, we don't have any boats. You're the Navy. Like, well, we have boats. We just don't have boats small enough for you to dive off of. But we spent a week in Newport after Labor Day, and I spent probably about 22 hours underwater during that week. And our team, as did each member of our team, we moved 16,000 shoots from Newport over to Greenwich Bay on the other side of Narragansett Bay. Got them all tucked in. We left 3 weeks later. a storm came up and wiped out everything. So, acts of nature, there's nothing you can do about it. It's a very labor-intensive, generally low success rate.
I recall that maybe 5 to 10 years ago, one of the oceanside counties in New Jersey banned nitrogen-based fertilizers. Would something like that be helpful here?
Absolutely. There are slow-release fertilizers as well that are actually, better than a lot of the stuff on the shelf, or nitrogen-free for towns that are in the coastal zone. There are other. So I've worked with the town of West Tisbury on the vineyard, and they've added a bylaw, a no anchor bylaw in seagrass. They have a bay scallop fishery, so they're very concerned about their seagrass. Bay scallops rely on seagrass for their habitat, and so they passed a bylaw: no one can anchor in the seagrass. Manchester by the Sea is another town that I'm working with. They're trying to craft something similar. Swampscott as well. So there are local actions that can be taken that can improve the situation for this particular species.
Not sure if I
Oh.
read your, oh, sorry.
That's okay.
I was just going to mention that I have worked in communities where they do have in their water protection zones, they mandate the use of the slow-release nitrogen fertilizer. And that's been, gosh, that was back in 2008, and that was the town of North Andover. So it's not even a coastal community. So that's, another local action. You could talk to your local conservation commission, your, planning office, and see what the regulations are in terms of the stormwater management regulations, whether they've included protections such as the slow-release nitrogen.
Sir?
First slide, very early, it was on millions of grams per hectare per year, and the law, and it looked like it was from roughly minus 70
Yes.
loss to plus 80
85.
gains.
Yes.
Can you comment on the loss mechanism?
Yeah, so again, that's a reflection of when these habitats degrade, they start releasing the carbon that they've accumulated. And so as these habitats decline due to poor water quality, coastal development, whatever, that carbon in the sediments gets liberated and added back to the environment. So these habitats, which are generally sinks, become sources. And that's what that number reflects.
So the bed still exists, but it becomes a source?
No, the bed slowly, or degrades and disappears, and all that sediment that had been held in place by those roots and rhizomes now become liberated and recycled back into the ocean and ultimately into the atmosphere.
Yeah, aside from humans, what are some of the other diseases or predators for seagrasses? And can you relate that to the change in the ocean environment that we expect to see over the next 20 to 50 years?
Yeah, so in the 1930s, there was an outbreak of something called the wasting disease, where 90% of the eelgrass on the western Atlantic coast died. And as a result, some of the species that rely on it, so the brant population crashed, because at that time brant did not realize they could eat baseball fields. They were primarily, exclusively eating eelgrass. The bay scallop population crashed, and there's actually a snail called the eelgrass limpet that went extinct, because the only eelgrass that survived was vegetation that was in the lower part of rivers, because the disease organism is strictly a marine species. So in areas where the vegetation was growing in more brackish water or slightly lower salinity water, the disease could not penetrate there. And so why the outbreak occurred, was it sunspots, sea temperature, poor water quality? No one really knows. It was one of those things where it had never happened before. No one was really studying it. A lot of people were interested in seagrass primarily because they were interested in waterfowl. So there's like several publications from the 40s from different wildlife biologists in Massachusetts who were mapping eelgrass, not because they cared about the eelgrass, but because they cared about where the waterfowl would be eating the eelgrass. So that's a natural phenomenon. Well, we think it's a natural phenomenon. Why it happens? Could it happen again in the future? Yes. We don't know the trigger mechanism. Could a warmer ocean, more acidic ocean? Possibly. So I forget the other part of your question. Other things that eat seagrass, was that? So brant geese here, these guys, manatees, eat a tropical species, ironically enough, called manatee grass. Sea turtles eat turtle grass. And there are a number of invertebrates, amphipods and isopods, little crustaceans up here that will also nibble on it. And a couple of small snail species that will eat it as well. But mostly here it's geese, black duck are the primary consumers of it. The majority of it actually ends up entering the food chain as detritus. So that the plant will shed the leaves will float around for quite some time and break down and then enter the food chain as detritus.
Would the health of our marshes not be improved if money were allocated to fill in the trenches that were dug during the Depression?
Yeah, it's a little bit outside my area of expertise, and there's been a lot of talk about treating marshes, plugging those channels, or something also called thin layer deposition to help the marsh keep up with sea level rise. I think all of those are still highly experimental.
In your experience, how have the efforts of the EPA been impacted by the Trump administration?
Are you trying to get me fired? Let me.
What did he say?
He wanted to know how the efforts of the EPA had been affected by the Trump administration. Again, this is my personal opinion. I can only tell you, I'll give you my personal experience. So from 2012 to 2016, I was one of 6 U.S. representatives on international work group with colleagues from Mexico and Canada who were attempting to catalog the amount of blue carbon in North America. And we had gotten funding from the U.S., Canada, Mexico, various government entities in those countries to the tune of $1 million for those 4 years. And we were making good progress. We had maps of all those habitats for the entire North America. We had started collecting carbon data, and we needed 2 more years of funding to bring those 2 data sets together to come up with an estimate. The election happened, and we were no longer funded. And I can't comment why. I'll let you figure that out.
Is there an effort being made to do research for a more hardy type of eel grass?
Yeah, so there have been some studies where people have looked for what I'll call superior genetic strains, and so there are some strains of seagrass or eelgrass in particular that have adapted to growing in lower light conditions or higher nitrogen. So the plants in Great Bay, for instance, tend to be hardier because they grow in those type of conditions than some of the plants from, maybe Cohasset or an area that's cleaner. Now, those have just been kind of experiments where we're transplanting back and forth between water bodies and kind of seeing what happens. I don't think there's been any really effort to kind of produce new strains or some kind of hybrid that may be superior, but that's for maybe the next generation of scientists. Yes.
Has there been any study of the effects of oyster farming relative to seagrass and clarification of water with the oyster farm?
Yeah. So there's been a lot of general thought that filtration by oysters may be beneficial, and shellfish in general, not just oysters, blue mussels and others. Their filtration activity will clear the water and actually have a benefit to seagrass. And so there's been a thought, particularly in Great Bay, where they're trying to also restore oysters, to co-locate restoration projects. It's hard enough to really get one restoration project to work. When you start putting two together and hoping you hope there's some symbiosis between the two, but I haven't seen any hard and fast data to support. I mean, theoretically, it should work, but I haven't seen any data to actually support it as being beneficial.
Sea level effects have any detrimental effect on the fields?
So sea level rise, so seagrass tends to be a very shallow water plant, and as sea level rise occurs, those meadows will retreat towards the shoreline. And as long as the sediment is sufficient so that the plants can get their roots and rhizomes into it, so it's not solid rock or seawall, the meadows will retreat into shallow water and they'll do fine. But there are areas, so that meadow I showed you in the hunt, literally it is, the cove is surrounded by rock cliff. And so those meadows do not have very far to go before they run into a substrate they can't colonize. And there are plenty, not so much in Massachusetts, but in Maine. You think about the rocky coast of Maine, a lot of those meadows in Maine are not going to have a place to go, not in our lifetime anyway. So it becomes a problem.
Question about relative sizes of carbon sinks. It seems to me that microflora and fauna in surface algae and diatoms in the ocean is, just by biomass alone, is so much larger by orders of magnitude than seagrass, that why pay attention to seagrass? Is it just that seagrass is the only thing we can affect? Or is there some other lever that I'm missing?
No, I think the difference is diatoms and macroalgae and a lot of these other plants, which are prolific, and phytoplankton by biomass is just orders of magnitude greater, but they don't sequester the carbon. They absorb it and then they get eaten and it gets excreted and it goes back, gets recycled. So these three habitats are the only three that, because they create an anaerobic environment, so the sediment without oxygen, that carbon stays locked up and stays away. And that's, a benefit to society. Oh, you're not allowed to ask any questions.
So Phil, do you ever see a day in the future where a market can be created for coastal wetlands and valuation on carbon so that people are actually paid to restore and farm carbon with coastal wetlands? Yeah,
so there is, not here at the moment, but in Europe and other parts of the planet, you can buy carbon credits. And there are approved methods that if you need to purchase carbon offsets, you can restore salt marsh, you can restore seagrass, And there are procedures on how you would measure the carbon associated with those restored habitats to generate the credits you're looking for. And it's basically it's like a 3-year monitoring program after you do the restoration to show that the habitat is still viable, it's actually accumulating carbon over time, and how much carbon it is accumulating over time for you to get credit. And again, I don't remember off the top of my head what carbon is going for these days in that carbon market, but it's still pretty cheap at the moment.
Bill, what about all the plastic islands in the lake? Sorry.
No.
How is that affecting the grass?
It's a timely question. I just wrote a proposal literally 2 weeks ago looking at microplastics and seagrasses. So if you think about the physics of this, so those meadows, as I described, they stick up in the water column and they cause organic particles to settle within the meadows themselves. Well, the physics are the same for microplastics. And so we believe that these meadows are probably concentrating microplastics at a much higher rate than surrounding unvegetated areas. The bad thing about that is that what I didn't really talk about tonight, which I do usually talk about at these talks on seagrass, is seagrasses are nursery habitats for many, many different fish and invertebrates. So you have a lot of small, sensitive life stages for many species growing, feeding, hiding in these habitats, now in close proximity to high concentrations of microplastics. And that's not a good scenario. And so myself and others in my office, hopefully will be funded to start doing research on that very topic.
Can I ask another question?
Yeah.
Has there been, I'm not a chemist to know about chemistry and carbon, but is there any way that they can find a way to get rid of the carbon or do away with it or suck it up or absorb it or?
Yeah, so there's actually a lot of work now being done looking at carbon sequestration technologies. How can we absorb carbon out of the atmosphere and isolate it? There's a couple of challenges with that. One, you can't use energy to do it because then you're kind of defeating the purpose. So it needs to be a passive system generally. And the other challenge is doing it on a scale that would make a difference. So if you're talking about the global carbon cycle, you're going to need a lot of these things to remove the carbon. And people are working on this, and I'm sure that within our lifetimes, there'll be attempts through technology to scrub carbon out of the atmosphere. Now, I find it hard to believe we can do it more efficiently than plants who have evolved over billions of years, but we got to do something.
Are the planes a big contributor to dumping all the fuel and putting gases in the atmosphere above?
Planes are a large carbon source, and I'm guilty of traveling a lot. So I have, despite the fact that I drive a Prius, I feel guilty traveling as much as I do, but they are a huge carbon footprint.
Sort of following the question about what were asked earlier about other means of sequestering. I recall reading an article sometime in the last few months about using algae in the open ocean, basically going through a life cycle of algae, which then settles to the bottom of the open ocean and gets sequestered at very low temperature at depth. And that, I don't recall how they were trying to stimulate, or how it was being contemplated algal growth might be stimulated, but the idea was to stimulate algal growth and sequester carbon that way.
Yeah, so I've seen a lot of people talk about adding iron to the ocean to spike phytoplankton growth. And again, that's experimental. It may provide a short-term, population explosion where you get a sudden increase in or absorption of carbon, but it's It's hard to see that being sustainable. In addition, you need the phytoplankton to settle, below the photic zone and get into the deep ocean to have it really be, isolated. And there's no guarantee that that would happen.
All right. I want to thank Phil for his excellent presentation. I also wanted to acknowledge Salisbury Community Television and Newbury Community Television for their efforts to record this. There's a lot of machinery back there that you didn't see when you came in the room, but there's going to be a YouTube video of this presentation if you want to view it again later. Or if people missed it on Facebook or don't have access to Facebook, you can let them know that it's going to be on our YouTube channel, and you can go to storm-surge.org. You can find all of our recorded presentations there, even ones that you maybe haven't attended from the past. So I want to thank you again for coming out on this kind of damp night, and see you at the next program. Thanks.